Please join me in giving Dr. J. Price a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, thank you so much, John. It's always great to be here among so many familiar faces and say hi to people, and it's great. You have a real asset in someone like John to bring the community together, to have some conversation about where we are and where we're going and how do we think through this. And if you ever have John as a student in your class, you know you're going to have some good discussion, and so it's always been a great privilege to have that. I've talked about As Goes Kansas, So Goes the Nation before, especially to this group. So I wanted to take a little bit of a different tack on it, because we tend to think about As Goes Kansas, So Goes the Nation as a sense of Kansas being a leader, a trendsetter in American society. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. And one of the ways to get at that is some of the regional literature that's growing. There is a large body of literature and growing body of literature from people like James Shortridge, John Lauck, and others who are studying the Midwest and how did the Midwest and the Great Plains come to embody so much of the American story, and how has that shifted. So I want to talk a little bit about not just Kansas, but the larger region, and then how this ties especially into the political, but also some of the cultural and social dynamics of the country as well. So if we think about how the American system developed, the American system was designed to skew rural. It emerged at a time when most Americans lived on small farms. Cities were limited. There were a handful on the coast. We were a pre-industrial society. The American experiment began at the very end of an agrarian age. And that shapes a lot of who we are. There was an assumption of a relative equal distribution of farms across the landscape, some larger from estates, small farms in other areas, but largely the assumption was that the landscape would have a relatively equal distribution of farms. So when they talked about the scale of states, big states and small states, they really talked about this in terms of physical territory. When the American experiment came together, there was a concern about large states like New York and small states like Delaware, and they physically meant landscape, size. And they realized that trying to balance that out as the country grew was going to be a challenge. And so from the time of the American development in, say, the Old Northwest, today we call it the Great Lakes, and beyond, the practice was to try to create states roughly equal, more or less, in size. If you read, for example, Mark Stein's book, How the States Got Their Shapes, he emphasized the idea of the principle that all states should be created equal. And that was hard to do in the 13 colonies time, but as we moved west, that was easier to manage. In fact, Stein says the principle that all states should be created equal was deeply and consciously rooted in the foundations of the United States. And so, as we see the development of states brought in, they seem to be roughly comparable in size. We see this with Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas. And then, with the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, we see new opportunities. Now, of course, initially the Louisiana Purchase was a buffer. It was a frontier. It was the borderland between the United States and the Mexican nation, and prior to that, the Spanish Empire. In fact, when Bent's Fort was created in the 1830s, it was a border town. Bent's Fort on the Ark River was on the U.S.-Mexican border. It was the Juarez of its day. Beyond it, or between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains, was confirmed in 1834 through the Trade and Intercourse Act, the permanent Indian frontier. Indian Territory was this vast stretch of lands that went from Canada down to Texas. And again, it was seen as a buffer between the United States and points west. Then we have the Mexican War of the 1840s that brings in California, Utah, the desert Southwest, Nevada, Texas, and the fallout of that discussion then expands the United States to the coast. And now what had once been the frontier, the buffer land, is now the center of the continent. And that really does prompt the United States to rethink about who it is and how it's arranged on the land. In 1853, Congress passes the Pacific Railroad Survey Bill, appropriating the War Department under Secretary of War Jefferson Davis to survey possible railroad routes to connect this vast continent. By the way, George McClellan of the Corps of Topographical Engineers was the one in charge of that. So before the Civil War, the connections were a little different. Well, with that development, we see the opening up of the interior with, for example, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Kansas being on south, and then this vast stretch of land to the north being Nebraska that will eventually be divided up. And what will evolve out of this is the creation of 4 states roughly equal in height. And Stein's book shows that. If you look at the map, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas are roughly equal in height. The idea was that they would be roughly more or less equal in size. They were 4 degrees in height, to be exact, for you survey buffs. Now, from the Rocky Mountains west, that was harder to maintain. The states are going to be somewhat bigger, but they're still basically squares and are more apt to be equal, at least in width, than in height. And then when that's expanded out as the big grid, you see this cluster of states in the middle of the country that are going to be developing roughly equal in size. Fast forward after the Civil War. Now the center part of the country is undergoing a shift. At one time, the country thought of itself divided between east and west. The east of the Mississippi, was divided north and south along the along the Ohio River, and the Mason-Dixon line. To the west, the land was a little bit different, and you had horizontal designations, and James Shortridge in his book, The Middle West, really highlights this. You had the northern west, the southern west, and the middle west. It was a horizontal designation that included Kansas and Nebraska. And initially, the West was seen as out there. It wasn't settled particularly heavily. It was rough. It was wild. Remember, Lincoln is from the West, from Illinois, when he is elected. But now that transforms itself. Chicago goes from being an outpost on the edge of the Great Lakes to one of the largest cities in the country. Industry takes root in the Great Lakes. We see the settlement and development of agriculture in the Old Northwest and in the Great Plains. We see the development of the Corn Belt, the Dairy Belt, various wheat belts. There's a spring wheat belt and a winter wheat belt, of which we're part of the latter. We have the beginnings of an idea that the heart and soul of the United States is actually shifting, and it's going to be in this great hub, this axle around which the country will revolve. Now, there's a question about where this axle is going to actually be, and a number of cities vie for control over that. St. Louis, Cincinnati, Louisville. Others make a claim for this. Chicago is going to emerge as that cornerstone for a variety of reasons. But over time, the center part of the country is developed, it's settled with farms, and now we start seeing these spaces having a national political voice. We have to remember that in 1860, west of that line from Minnesota down to Louisiana, only 3 states had electoral college votes: Texas, California, and Oregon. By 1890, we have 12 states. And they're small in population, but they're politically powerful, again, because of the structure of our country. And again, going back to the idea that the Founding Fathers intended our structure to be rural, or to skew rural. That's where you have the states having equal votes in the Senate, which is really the centerpiece of the American experiment in the 19th century. That check on the power of both the lower house as well as of the executive. You also see those in state governments, though, as well, that state legislatures tend to represent the entirety of the state as opposed to the handful of cities. And so state capitals are traditionally going to skew to rural interests rather than urban ones in the 19th century. And that pattern, again, is replicating itself. So now the country starts taking a look at what's going on in the middle of the country. And it's in that conversation then that Kansas really starts to emerge. And so I started looking at that phrase, as goes Kansas, so goes the nation. And fortunately, digital databases with newspapers, such as newspapers.com and Chronicling America, are phenomenal resources. You can start looking into patterns on this. One of the first descriptions of this phrase comes from 1888, and it says, "Our esteemed contemporary admits that the national politics in these matters, Kansas, as politics stands in Kansas, so stand the country at large." Well, that settles it. Kansas will give about 80,000, majority for Harrison and protection. Back when again, this is that protection free state. Free trade, conversation, the protection of industry versus free trade. The Republican Party was very solidly a party of protection of industry at the time. That was Benjamin Harrison's conversation at the time. So Kansas's old soldiers have no earthly use for the great veto, but are rallying around the gallant Benjamin Harrison. As goes Kansas, so goes the nation. We'll accept the proposition. And indeed, Kansas becomes a place that people look to. Now, Kansas has had a reputation of this since the 1850s. In the Bleeding Kansas era, the rest of the country watched as free state and pro-slavery forces challenged each other in the pro-slavery Lecompton government, and then later the shift in 1858 into the Bleeding Kansas era. It's into that mix that certainly John Brown emerges as a media figure, and the country is watching what goes on in Kansas as a sense of what might happen elsewhere in the country. So by the Gilded Age, which is the fancy academic term that historians use to describe the period from the 1860s to the 1890s, Kansas again starts emerging as a place that people are looking to for what's going on. And we see this with the "as goes Kansas, so goes" conversation, but it's not always on the same issue. In 1882, a paper in Chanute says, "As goes Kansas, so the eastern states will follow." They were referring about supporting prohibition, the state prohibition law of 1881. In 1887, there were a wave of articles. You have to remember that newspapers at the time had no problem with cutting and pasting. And an article would come out in one newspaper, and rest assured, the rest of the newspapers in the area would cut and paste it almost verbatim. So you see this a lot in the literature. But one of the quotes is, "When it is dry in Kansas, it is dry all over the Union. When it is hot here, it is hot everywhere. Just so when it is cold or wet, as goes Kansas, so goes the Union in weather matters." Then there are the developments of the 1890s, and it's the development of frustration with the existing party structure and the emergence of an alternate political perspective called populism. It emerges out of the Farmers' Alliance movements of the 1880s. and it challenges the establishment in the Great Plains as well as other parts of the country. So here in Kansas, that means a challenging of the Republican Party, which is very, very strong in the Kansas story, has been so since the 1860s. And so as a wave of alliance figures meet to think about an alternate political structure, things come to a head in 1891 at a convention in Cincinnati. And so the phrasing that goes on and on in the papers is, as goes Kansas and Nebraska, and they sometimes lumped Kansas and Nebraska together in that, so goes the convention. And as one historian of this says about, in the wake of this, among these few were those interested in moving away from compromise towards a separate party, and among these few, the most interested and active were those from Kansas. So the Kansas folks in particular are really interested in breaking away from the existing parties. People like William Peffer, for example, are going to be part of this. And that will ultimately result in a rift in the political landscape and the formation of the Populist Party, which really emerges in national political circles in 1892. There's some prequels in 1889, 1890, but it's in 92 where it becomes a national piece. And now, as the 1890s unfold, Republicans and populists both look to Kansas as a symbol for what's going on. So if the populists are saying, as goes Kansas, so goes the Union in 1892, the Wichita Eagle in 1896 says Kansas was the first state in the Union to instruct for McKinley. These are the Republicans favoring McKinley in the existing party structure. And it says, this proves that as the nation goes, so goes Kansas. Oh, so in other words, we're typical of where the Republican Party wants to be rather than a bellwether. So the piece to think about this is that both the populists and the Republicans claim that Kansas is the place where this is going to develop and show the rest of the country what's going to happen. Now, firebrands like Peffer and others capture the attention of the media. And you have to remember that people like Peffer, but also people like John Brown, and even later on people like Carrie Nation, who will emerge in prominence in 1900, certainly with her efforts at the Carey House Hotel just across the street over there in December, are the firebrands. They're the activists. And they're challenging the national conversation, but they're doing so by challenging the existing establishment. John Brown had no use for pro-slavery folks. But his real target wasn't the pro-slavery folks. He's not going to change the mind of David Rice Atchison. That's not his goal. His goal is to challenge the Free State Republicans in Lawrence and Topeka and rattle their cages enough to do something different. Similarly, Carrie Nation she'd love to have someone who is a saloon owner abandon it and become a temperance advocate. She would love that. But her real target is the WCTU and the moderate prohibitionists that, yes, we have statewide prohibition, but our Governor Stanley, doesn't really enforce it. And so she's really taking to task the prohibitionists in the Republican Party in Kansas and saying, why aren't you doing more about this? That's the real target. And in fact, Carrie Nation will go up in 1901 up to Topeka, smash more saloons up there, encounter Governor Stanley, right at the same time as the Kansas temperance forces meet for their state convention, and she's not really on the invite list. So now she's really mad and starts taking her cause to the paper and writing editorials. And one of the wonderful insights from that paper was that she wrote a letter to the children of Kansas saying that saloon owners had tied up Kansas, and it's your patriotic duty, your civil duty, to go and throw rocks through their windows. Telling children to go smash the window of a saloon. Could you imagine how that would go today? So that's who she's really targeting. And similarly, Peffer, too, going back to our conversation on the populists. Peffer was a Republican. In fact, a lot of the populists of Kansas were Republicans. They were frustrated with the Republican establishment. They had real issues with the political arrangement, the economic arrangement. They had issues on silver and so forth. But Peffer didn't want to join with the Democrats. That was a concept called fusionism. He was very adamant, don't connect with that. He's a Republican in most ways on a handful of issues. So he's challenging in a lot of ways the existing Republican establishment rather than trying to rally the troops around the Democrats. Well, what happens is that the populists bring a number of issues to the fore. McKinley wins the election of 1896. And over time, William Allen White, for example, who had very much criticized the populists in favor of the Republicans in his classic What's the Matter with Kansas, and White will criticize the populists, but will actually be a cornerstone of the progressive wing of the Republican Party, the reform wing of the Republican Party. Will work very closely with his friend Henry J. Allen of the Wichita Beacon, eventually, to push for the progressive wing of the Republican Party. These are bull moose Republicans. In fact, Henry J. Allen will be at the main convention. Allen will be one of the figures who delivers some of the speeches that are really controversial so that Teddy Roosevelt doesn't have to, because that would be a little awkward. And as the Lawrence Daily World said in 1909, as goes Kansas, so goes the nation wantonly, says Mr. Allen. The Kansas barometer in 1896 was emotionally befuddled, however, and one William Jennings Bryan carried the state. We supported the populist/Democrat fusionist Bryan. How about the nation in Kansas's popular emotion? Well, who does not remember with pride that William McKinley was chosen with deep chagrin, that Kansas's popular emotion led our being styled the nation's freak reservation? Would to God that we would divorce ourselves forever from the barometrical emotion. So maybe we're not the bellwether we think we are. Kansas also, though, has a presence on the national stage. Part of it has to do with sheer population. As Kansas is developed in the Gilded Age, you see ways of counties established, farms across the state. And we have a population to match. In 1890, we had a population of 1,400,000, give or take, ish. 1890. California had a population of 1,200,000. We were bigger than California. We had 8 congressional districts as of 1893 through in 1913. So in the turn of the century, we had 8 districts. Nebraska had 6 congressional districts, by the way, and Nebraska is absolutely part of this parallel conversation. Colorado had 2 electoral districts, but by 1913 that was up to 4. California had 7 electoral districts, though that had grown to 11. So Kansas had a larger population in California and a larger presence in Congress. And so as Kansas looks around, it turns with pride on how far it's come. When it celebrates its 50th anniversary, there's a wave of interest saying that we had come out of the political storm and now we're emerging in leadership. As Frank Blackmar's Kansas Cyclopedia says, perhaps no other commonwealth admitted into the Union during the last half-century has had greater historical interest than Kansas, born in the storm and stress period of national political controversy, cradled in the tumult of civil war, and reared to full statehood in an era unparalleled in the arts of peace. The life of Kansas has been one of intense activity, carved out of the territory once known as the Great American Desert. By industry, her people have become one of the most productive and wealthy states in the Union in proportion to its population. From the political unrest of the early life sprung a people alive to progressive forms of government. Alert in educational affairs from the beginning, her schools have been monuments of greatness and her people interested in the justice and equity of human relationship. Her laws for securing rights and political, industrial, social order are among the most enlightened in the land. We are a showcase for a number of progressive reforms, everything from the Good Roads movement to Crumbines Don't Spit on the Sidewalk. We are a center for a number of alternate movements, everything from the populist movement of the 1890s. We were the socialist hub of the universe in southeastern Kansas, with the appeal to reason being centered in Girard, Kansas. And in fact, a lot of figures, by the way, go back and forth between Republican, populist, socialist, and back to Republican or progressive. You see this migration back and forth, which is its own conversation for another time. But even in the 19th century, we weren't the deal-maker state. If you look at where our presidents come from in the Gilded Age, they tend to come from Ohio, or New York, or New Jersey. And there's some reasons for that. One, there's some big population centers there. Second, those were states divided between Democrat and Republican. And in the 19th century, the Gilded Age was a time when the two sides were about equally matched, and you didn't switch sides. That was seen as disloyal. So your goal to effect change in an election was to get your team out to vote, which means that states that were roughly equally divided, like those of the Old Northwest, tend to have a great deal of power and influence because that helps tip one state or the other. Kansas and Nebraska are an extension of the Middle West, of that what's called the Midwest, Middle West, that's really now centering around the Great Lakes, that industrial heartland. And so we're a place where people look for issues, but we're not always the deal-maker state. And then things continue to shift. One shift, for example, is the 17th Amendment, in which the Senate is chosen not by state legislatures, but rather by popular election. And so that's going to shift how political changes at the state level impact the national story. In 1920, the census shows for the first time that the American population is urban, where people live in cities now. And the population of cities far outweighs rural populations, and people are starting to think, well, how do we reconcile that? We have the growth of industry and immigration in those populations. That really changes a lot of things. When you have a population that goes from being a nation of farmers who are largely individual landowners outside of the sharecropping areas, especially of the South, but these are landowners, their own entrepreneurs in a sense, to a nation of wage earners, where you get a paycheck from an employer. I mean, that really does shift the entire conversation. So to put perhaps not too fine a point on it, the challenge of talking about government and regulation and taxes and so forth isn't just about one group or some agenda. This is about the very Industrial Revolution itself. That changes things. And the United States' culture is shifting as well. We have a more national media and national culture. And population centers are where those are clustered in places like New York, California, Chicago, and so forth. I mean, there's a reason why you see the big publishers from New York, movies coming from California, and then our media figures for the news coming out of Chicago with that Midwest accent. The United States is still seen in a sense as America distilled. I mean, this is the world of Norman Rockwell. This is the world of small-town America that the United States still embraces. And Kansas is absolutely part of that. I was at a conference a couple of years ago where a person looking at sci-fi notices that if they really want to make a point in a science fiction horror type of genre, they set it in Kansas. Well, because aliens and supernatural things, I mean, they take out New York all the time, and it's almost a cottage industry to take out Los Angeles. I mean, you could expect that. But when the critters land in Kansas, no, wait a minute. We're supposed to be safe. We're supposed to not be like that. And so that there's an edge to it when we see that. So as the Midwest continues to embody American ideals, but not always in the center of population, we start seeing some rethinking of what that looks like. You see, for example, the development of what's sometimes called the Missouri Bellwether. The idea that Missouri is somehow typical, unquote, of the American experience, and it has some blending of North and South and East and West and so forth. In the 20th century, Missouri called all but 3 presidential elections, and it's become less predictable over the years, but for a long time there was the parallel to as goes Kansas, so goes the nation was as goes Missouri, so goes the nation. So it's not just that Kansas holds on to this image, but Missouri does as well. The Iowa straw poll is certainly part of this. So we look to Iowa, that sense of small town America. Political candidates still go out there as somehow embodying America at its roots. The thing is that that's a tradition that's fairly recent. It really happens in the wake of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, in part because of the way Iowa's system works in terms of the Iowa caucus system. And so that really emerges from the Democratic Party in 1972 and the Republican Party in 1976. So, but that's still that sense of how Iowa is a gauge of what might happen in the future. So that Midwest identity is still there. And yet, look at our presidents. Truman coming out of Missouri, again with northern and southern ties. Eisenhower, certainly we better know that one if we're sitting in this room. But at a speech at the Guildhall in London, June 12th, 1945, he's not a political figure yet. He's a hero from the Second World War. And he says this: "I come from the very heart of America. In the superficial aspects by which we ordinarily recognize family relationships, the town where I was born and the one where I was reared are far separated from this great city. Abilene, Kansas, and Denison, Texas would together equal in size possibly 1/500th a part of Greater London." Then he continues on. "When we consider these things, then the valley of the Thames draws closer to the farms of Kansas and the plains of Texas." 2 places. He's claiming a Texas identity as much as a Kansas one. He will always have this rootedness to Abilene, but it's not exclusive. Abilene doesn't get to claim him entirely. Denison, Texas is absolutely part of his identity. And when he retires from the presidency, he doesn't return to Abilene. Where's his farm? Gettysburg, yeah. I mean, that tells you something about his identity and where he's positioning himself. He's more of a national citizen than a Kansan in some ways. And then as the later 20th century unfolds, we see that Kansas's share in the political conversation is starting to shift as well. 1970 was the year that Kansas and Colorado had the same number of districts. Kansas by now had declined to 5. Colorado had grown to 5 as well. By 83, it was up to 6 for Colorado, and Kansas remained at 5. And then by 93, Kansas was down to 4. Meanwhile, from 1973 to 2013, Arizona grew from 4 to 9 districts. So there's a growth that's going on as Kansas maintains and then starts to shrink. And part of this is demographic, and in another talk here, I've shown you probably what I think is the most significant map to understand Kansas history out there. It's when major counties in Kansas peaked in population. because our counties were creating that boom year of the 1880s where build it and they will come. We'll just have a state flooded with farms from end to end. And you start looking, and we have counties, especially western Kansas, that have been declining in population since 1930, 1920. The Dust Bowl played a lot to do with that. But we have counties in southeastern Kansas that have been declining since 1890. I mean, this is a long-term shift, and it relates to a lot of different layers, which we could unpack if we wanted to. Kansas's electoral votes. In 1896 had 10, Missouri had 17, Colorado had 4, California had 9. We were the second largest presence of the West. In the 2012 election, California has 55, Kansas has 6. And so that becomes a shift, and that's part of a larger shift, and we see the national political scene looking to what's called the Sun Belt, especially with figures like Kevin Phillips and his emerging Republican majority concept that the West and the South, the big cities of the West and the South, will merge together as the South becomes disenchanted with the Democratic Party, and Kevin Phillips, who will be an advocate for bringing the South into the Republican Party, will emerge as those two regions now. The Sun Belt is the core of the American experience. And so as that unfolds, start looking at where our presidents start coming from. People like Ronald Reagan, who's from Illinois, but is really a Californian in that regard. Look at figures like Barry Goldwater, who is going to be running in 64 from Arizona. I mean, think of how that energy is shifting away from New England, such as the Kennedys. There's a temptation to think that Kansas's political nemesis or its challenger are the blue states of the Northeast. But it's actually the South that's probably the bigger challenge. The South is becoming much more of a presence politically. Look at our presidents. We start getting presidents from the South for the first time, really since the 19th century. LBJ, South and West with Texas. Carter, Clinton, George W. Bush. In fact, in the late 1990s, you looked at the political roster, and we had a president from Arkansas with his successor from Texas, vice president from Tennessee, Newt Gingrich, Georgia, President pro temp of the Senate, Strom Thurmond from the South, the Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott from Mississippi. Notice a trend here? The South becomes an incredibly important part of society. In fact, this was the heyday of a lot of Southern aspects in American society. What had once been country and Western music becomes what could be sometimes called country and Southern. The Southern influence in country becomes much more prevalent. Meanwhile, the Midwest is embodied in figures like Bob Dole, who is now seen as a holdover from an earlier age when the Midwest and the Great Plains were absolutely central, but seems a little different than where the political landscape is now. Today we live, though, in a very competitive landscape, even from the 1990s. Once again, our landscape looks a lot of ways like that of the Gilded Age. Two sides equally matched, and there's a lot of competition. And so it's not surprising that, again, those states that are borderline states have an enormous amount of influence. Our president is from New York. Our vice president is from Indiana. President pro temp of the Senate with connections to Iowa. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. John Boehner, Ohio. Paul Ryan, Wisconsin. I mean, these are border states. Now, we have an influence with people like Mike Pompeo, for example, from Kansas and so forth. But the challenge is that it's in the border states where the real energy and the deal-making can happen politically. So people tend to think, as goes Kansas, so goes the nation. We're a bellwether state just because we're just that awesome. And we're a pretty awesome state, don't get me wrong. We're a leader in a lot of areas. But we tended to be noticed because we were a place where there was division, especially division within political institutions, political parties. And that plays the role. It's an intense one. And so when that happens, then they watch Kansas. But when we're very solidly in one camp, and reliably in one camp, if I'm a politician, I need to use my limited resources in places where there's a bigger bang for buck, to be perfectly honest. You know that there's a challenge when candidates come to Kansas. And I think, how will we know, as goes Kansas, so goes the nation? When national political leaders start coming here again in large numbers. That will be the sign that things have shifted and we're once again in the national spotlight. It can happen, we just know that we have to look for it and be prepared for it. So with that, I know a number of you have to head on back to other obligations, and I appreciate you taking the time to allow me to explore some of these issues. But I'm happy to take some questions or comments before we go, right?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, fantastic.
Thank you for coming to speak to the Pachyderm.
Sure.
I really appreciate you telling us about Kansas having 8 congressional districts. Can you tell us what year that started and what year it ended? Because I think that's worth something for all of us to remember here.
Sure, that was in the turn of the century. So we're talking basically the 1890s through through the early part of the 20th century, back when that growth in the Gilded Age was really strong. And in fact, that turn of the century was a time when the Midwest as a whole probably had the biggest presence politically. And we're talking from the Great Lakes on out into Kansas, Nebraska, and so forth. But that was also the time where you see populism, William James Bryan and so forth from Nebraska. But culturally, too. That's where Chicago was this powerhouse, and people like Frank Lloyd Wright are there, too. So it's really that turn of the century that's at its peak.
Okay, so how many years did we keep the 8?
That should have been, that we're talking a couple of decades, definitely. That were through the 20th century, early part of the 20th century.
Didn't that have something to do with the change in Washington in terms of freezing the number at 435 or whatever it was, the number of representatives?
What?
So that as population grew, that number would not get bigger and bigger?
It also has to do with the shift in, the shifts in representation come out on if the census is in 1890, the shift happens in 1893. So it's about 3 years after the census, which is why filling out the census, which is coming up, by the way, next year, is probably the bigger component of it. So it's proportionality is part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Price, just curious, what would you say about Mike Pompeo's chances at the presidency after Donald Trump?
What about Mike Pompeo's chances for the presidency after Donald Trump? I think it'll depend on what the situation looks like when that election takes place, as to when that election might take place. So that's where the country comes in. I think that the question is going to be what issues are going to resonate with him. I mean, he resonates very well with the Midwest. Is he going to resonate with some place like Florida? And for example, and so that's going to be, that's another bellwether state. In fact, there's some scholars now who are looking at places like Florida and elsewhere as a better bellwether for what goes on. What he'll stand for makes sense in Wichita, Kansas. Is it going to make sense elsewhere? And I think that's going to be the question. And how distinctive is he going to be compared to other candidates? I think that's probably going to be another challenge. Part of it also is name recognition. The fact that he has some name recognition now does play a role with that, as opposed to being just starting out as a large unknown on the national stage. That's going to play an issue as well. So, wish I could give you a more definite answer, but I think there's some larger contexts to that. Sir.
My name is John Costner, and I'm a farmer. And one of my neighbors was telling me that in the 30s, he went to buy some witch pigs to raise for the butcher. And before he left the farm, the guy tried to give him every hog on the farm. I've heard stories about people bringing the livestock to town and didn't have enough money left over to buy enough gas to get home.
Right.
Yet at the same time, there were soup lines that were blocks long in the cities, in the industrial
Yes.
part of the country where jobless rate was phenomenal. Can you give us some kind of an economic quid pro quo about what was happening and what we could do to avoid that in the future?
Sure. The question about there were soup lines in the 1930s, and yet farmers couldn't make enough to eat. One scholar about the Depression actually talks about the Depression and New Deal in Kansas, specifically Peter Fearon, says that the irony is that the Depression was a crisis of plenty. It was a crisis of overabundance. And there's actually, and it's not just in foodstuffs, but it's the fact that by the late 1920s, markets had become saturated. As many people who could buy a Model A bought a Model A. And the market had gotten saturated, and that was a contributing factor. Getting food to market. The question is that if somebody doesn't have money to pay for the food, how do you, without somebody intervening, either as charity or the government or somebody else, how do you bridge that? And so that becomes an issue. But actually a lot of more activist figures, people like Huey Long, for example, very much wanted the same thing. How are you...
He was assassinated in 1935.
He was, but early on he was saying that how is it that people are starving in a place with too much food and too little, and too much we're overproducing. How do you do that? How do you reconcile that? One of the most unpopular parts of the New Deal was the culling out of agricultural products, in part to create a smaller supply, so that raised the prices. As the old saw is that everybody wants a low price for bread and a high price for wheat, and you can't do that. This even goes back to the populist era, by the way. One of the challenges of the 1890s was that American farmers were too productive. They overproduced, and so there were only so many buyers for American wheat in 1890. How do you make a living on that? And then when the prices drop, you're encouraged, then you're trying to grow more, and that expands out, which just shrinks the supply even more. And so that was one of the reasons why, for example, farmers in the Democratic Party in the 19th century tended to be the party of farmers, wanted free trade. They wanted the trade to sell wheat to the Russian Tsar, if they really wanted to. Republicans wanted to protect American industry from the powerhouse that was the British industrial might. So that balance was there too. I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer for a really great question, and there are a lot of layers to that, as a matter of fact. It was a challenge even then to deal with.
Isn't part of the problem that they had price controls on what farmers could sell their grain for? So they produced too much, and if the market had just let them sell it as cheap as they could, then people could afford, and we wouldn't have had people out of food and had a big surplus.
Well, price controls and so forth. Now, one of the challenges, and we're getting back into the 1930s, and the caveat in this is you get 3 economic historians together, you're going to get 4 opinions. You really will. In terms of support, for example, in 1930, you had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which started a trade conflict with Europe, for example. So that's going to be a contributing factor. During the New Deal, they tried to encourage, through the AAA, crop subsidies, as well as certain controls on wages and prices, especially through the NRA, which is the National Recovery Administration. It's not the National Rifle Administration. National Rifle Association. My students get that one mixed up quite a bit. So different NRA. But that was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So they were wrestling with that, but it wasn't able to be fully implemented quite to the degree that a lot of the real strong New Dealers wanted. But yeah, that was a debate. Should we have let things work themselves out? Did the New Deal prolong the suffering? There's a whole school of thought with that. Again, it depends on which economic historian you read on that one.
Thank you, Dr. J. Price.
All right, thank you.